All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to um, our notes. So, today we are going to be talking about evolution and 4 of the 6 evidences for evolution. And we're actually going to go ahead and skip through these first couple of slides just in the interest of time. You guys definitely should go ahead and read through those. It definitely sets up what we're going to be talking about and just kind of hopefully answer some of the questions that you may have about evolution and all that before we get too far ahead into it. So definitely make sure that you take a look. I'm just not going to cover it for the interest of time. Okay, so our learning target for today, we want you guys to be able to demonstrate how organisms have evolved from a common ancestor using multiple forms of evidence. Today we're going to talk about 4 of those forms. Okay, our learning objectives for today, we want you guys to be able to define evolutionary theory. We want you guys to be able to identify and explain the 6 evidences of evolution. But again, we're only going to talk about 4 of them today. Alright, so to talk about evolution, it is very helpful to know what evolution actually means. So evolution is going to be the process of biological change by which descendants come to differ from their ancestors. Or a much simpler definition, and the definition that we'll be using for this course, populations change over time. Okay, so that's all we want you guys to know about evolution, is that populations change over time. Okay, and then over time, these populations begin to look less and less like their ancestors. Okay, and then this image is just depicting our evolutionary history, so from billions of years ago all the way down to present day over here. Okay, so a couple important notes about evolution. First thing to note is that evolution works with what it's got. Okay, all that we're saying here is that evolution is not a process where random events like the growing of an eyeball just happen. So you're not going to be looking at a microbe and then the next day that microbe is going to have an eyeball. That's not how it works. Evolution is a theory that basically means that you have to have pre-existing parts that evolution builds off of slowly and over and over and over again with time. Okay, so evolution works with what it's got, and we will look more into that in one of the evidences today. It's a very good example of how evolution works with what it's got. Okay, and then the second thing that I want to point out is only populations can evolve. Okay, so populations evolve, not individuals. Individuals cannot evolve. Individuals will only be able to adapt. So individuals will have certain adaptations that make them more fit to be in their environment. And these adaptations may be inherited. As these adaptations are inherited over time, these populations will change. So this change in the population over a set amount of time is what causes them to evolve. It's a very conceptual idea, a little bit hard to picture in our mind. Okay, so vocab and definitions that we want you guys to know. So common ancestor is going to refer to organisms that lived long ago, but is closely related to at least 2 living relatives today. So we might say something like the common ancestor of gorillas and chimps lived a few million years ago. Okay, so that would be an example of how we would use common ancestor in like a sentence. Okay, adaptation is going to be the biological mechanism by which organisms adjust to new environments or to changes in their current environments. So an adaptation is something that can happen to an individual. This adaptation leads these individuals to grow, this adaptation leads these individuals to have an advantage over the other individuals in the population, and this adaptation then allows for change to happen in the population. So for this adaptation to be inherited over and over and over again by offspring, and these offspring then will differ from the current population. Okay, so populations, so we've been talking so much about those. There are 4 things that I want you to remember about populations. So a population is the number of organisms of the same species that live in the same geographical area at the same time with the capability of interbreeding. Okay, so that means for population we have the same species, we have specific area, we have the, alive at the same time, and finally make babies. Okay, so these are the 4 parts of what a population is. So a population is going to be something, a group of the same species that live in the same geographic area at the exact same time, and they can make babies. Okay, so there are 4 parts to the population definition. Alright, so now we are going to get into our first form of evidence, and that is going to be observation. So scientific observation is often the easiest form of evidence to understand when looking at evolution, and observation usually entails looking at adaptations and how these adaptations benefit an organism, and then how that adaptation begins to spread into the population and become more of a common thing to be seen. So some examples would be long necks in giraffes, or antibiotic resistance in bacteria, or in the case of the next slide, a virus, specifically HIV. Okay, so what we're talking about with this example of evidence, so we have this giraffe here. This giraffe has a longer neck than the other giraffes in the population. However, compared to the normal modern day giraffe, the neck is quite short. But this longer neck leads to benefits. So this adaptation would be the long neck, and it leads to benefits to the organism, such as being able to find a mate because it is able to fight off other male giraffes. This then gets passed on to the offspring, and over time, the longer your neck is, the more beneficial it is, until we reach modern day giraffes, which have the very long necks, which helps them reach food, as well as when they fight, be able to win the rights to mate. Because remember that in the animal kingdom, males will often have to fight for the right to make babies. So the strongest individuals or the fittest individuals will be the ones that win out. Okay, so HIV resistance to drugs. So what I want you to know is that HIV is a serious disease that has been mutated multiple times to become resistant to medication. And what I want you to do is think how this, from the giraffe example, how this may happen. Okay, so the first step is going to be identifying the adaptation. Okay, so what is the adaptation? And then the second step is, how does this affect the population? Okay, so taking a look at this image, we see this anti-HIV drug that is preventing the replication of two variants. So these two variants will essentially die and not be able to reproduce themselves. Okay? So we have green, and we have orange, and then we also have purple. So we see that purple is actually going to be resistant to this drug. So the adaptation would be drug resistance. And then the how this adaptation affects the population. Well, we see that the green and the orange variants of HIV die off due to this drug, which opens up the floor for this purple variant of HIV to take over and proliferate, which just means it reproduces, grows, and becomes dominant in the body. And the medications that we have at our disposal are not able to take care of it. So for the HIV variant, this is a good thing. For humans, it would be a bad thing. So how does it affect the population of HIV? It allows it to continue to reproduce. Okay, and now this is an example of evolution and how we may observe evolution over a short period of time because of the fact that our population started out being 1/3 of the green, 1/3 of the orange, and maybe 1/3 of the purple. But as soon as the anti-HIV drug came into play, it wiped out these two. So now all of the HIV is going to be the purple variant. So 100% will be purple, which is just telling us now that the genetic information has changed over the course of the drug application in the human's body. Okay, so next form of evidence is going to be biogeography. If you guys remember, bio means life, and geography is just like the world. So this could be things like where continents are, that sort of thing. And it is the study and the distribution of organisms around the world. Okay, so we're going to be looking at flightless birds in particular, but species of finches, fruit flies, and also honey creepers are other species that would be great examples of biogeography. Another great one would be marsupials. So that would be things like kangaroos, koalas, and those sorts of things. But we are going to be looking at flightless birds. So we're going to be looking at the casowry, the ostrich, the ray, the emu, and the kiwi. But before we do that, we need to take a look at the mechanisms of biogeography, or what drives biogeography. And that would be two things. First being plate tectonics, and the second being continental drift. So plate tectonics is just going to state that the Earth's crust is floating on the mantle. So on the outside, if you want to think of it kind of like an egg, we have this hard outer shell, and then the inside is going to be this softer, gooier core, and the egg is, so if you crack the egg shell, it's just kind of floating on this gooey center. Okay? Then continental drift is just the idea that plates are moving as a result of plate tectonics. So the plates move very, very slowly. This is why we see things like earthquakes and those sorts of things. But yeah, so continental drift is just a process of the plates moving as a result of the Earth's crust floating on top of the mantle. Okay, so biogeography as evidence. So I just want to show you guys Pangaea. So Pangaea was formed about 251 million years ago. It is a supercontinent, the last supercontinent that we have seen in the world. And it is a combination of all of the world's continents. So all of Earth's land masses combined into one giant supercontinent, which means that we also only have one ocean at this time. About 135 million years ago, Pangaea began breaking up into two continents, which would be Laurasia and Gondwana. As you can see here, it is when the plates begin to shift and move in opposite directions, which causes the continents to slowly and gradually pull apart. 65.5 million years ago, also about the same time that the dinosaurs went extinct. What most people consider dinosaurs went extinct. North America, Eurasia, Africa, India, Madagascar, Antarctica, South America all became much more visible. And then this would be the present day up here at the top. This would be how we would see the Earth today. So Antarctica at the bottom, and then Africa, Eurasia, North America, South America, and Australia. Okay, so I'm going to erase this because we'll be using this slide for our next example of biogeography. So how did different forms of flightless bird species evolve? Okay, so millions of years ago, a common ancestor of flightless birds lived on Pangaea. So that, if you remember, Australia, parts of Papua New Guinea, Africa, and South America. So all of these areas is where this common ancestor of flightless birds would have lived. And then as Pangaea broke apart into the continents, we know today that the common ancestors of these modern flightless birds began building up mutations that benefited them in their new environment. So these mutations that benefited them in their new environment, these would be the adaptations. And these new mutations were able to be passed on throughout the generations until the modern day birds arose. Okay, so if we go back up, we will see right here, roughly, is where this common ancestor of the birds lived. When Pangaea began splitting, South America and Africa stayed together, but Australia began to drift apart. So we would have this common ancestor being split apart into, so some of them are still on the Australian continent, and some of them are going to be on the South American and the African continent. And then at the 65.5 million year mark, we have complete and total isolation of these species. And finally, we have the modern day position of these species in Africa, South America, Australia, Papua New Guinea, and New Zealand. Okay, so hopefully that kind of shows you how biogeography may split and is good evidence for evolution as it splits apart a common ancestor over time, which leads to these organisms being isolated and being able to develop into new species. Okay, so some anatomy as evidence. So here we have homologous structures. So homologous structures are features that are similar in structure, but differ in function. And that means that there was a recent common ancestor. Okay, so a good example of this would be forelimb structure in mammals. So you have our humerus. So this would be our upper arm. So this is what our bicep and tricep are going to rest on. Then we have the radius and the ulna. The ulna is going to be under. It's going to be what forms your elbow. And the radius will be on top. So kind of like up by your thumb. If you go down, that would be your radius. And those structures are going to make up your forearm. Then we have the carpals, which makes up your wrist, your metacarpals, which makes up the palm of your hand, and then finally your phalanges, which are your fingers, the actual digits that you move. So your metacarpals will just be your palm. Okay. Now, if we take a look at the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, we will see a very similar structure across all of these animals. So, we will see a humerus in all of these animals, although in the whale you can see it's very stumpy, and in the bat it's a little bit thinner than it would be in the cat or in the human. Then we have the radius and the ulna. Also see that these two bones pairing in the cat, the whale, and the bat. In the bat, the ulna is actually very, very small and thin to help it with its flight. Then we have the carpals in the cat, in the bat, and in the whale. In humans, this allows for a lot of mobility in the wrist. In cats, it's going to help for mobility when they're stepping. I don't believe that there's much movement for the carpals in whales or really in bats either, as these need to remain very kind of rigid as they're moving through the water or the air. And then we also have the metacarpals, which we see in the bat, the cat, and the whale, as well as in the humans. And then finally, the phalanges, or the fingers. So though they make up the fingers in the humans, they make up the toes of the cat. They also make up a large portion of the whale's flipper, as we can see here, and also a large portion of the bat's wing. Okay, so this would be an example of evolution working with what it's got. Okay, so we know that there's a recent common ancestor among these individuals based on this homologous structure, and this homologous structure changed over time to suit each of these species, how they were living, where they were living. So in the whale, these structures became into the form of a flipper. In the bat, they became into the form of a wing. In the cat, it became a leg. And in the human, it became an arm. Okay? So more anatomy as evidence. So this would be analogous structures example. So analogous structures are going to be different structurally, have similar function due to a similar environment, and it does not mean that there is a close common ancestor. So analogous structures and homologous structures are essentially opposites. So an analogy is going, if you guys remember or have ever used an analogy, if you took biology earlier this year with Mrs. Baltazar, you may remember when she had you guys create analogies for what a cell is, how it's like a factory or something like that. So we are going to compare structures that are similar in their function but completely different in their actual structure and how they're like built. Okay, and the reason that these body parts, limbs, those sorts of things are going to be similar in function but different in their structure is because they are in a similar environment. So for example, we have a shark, a penguin, and a dolphin. The shark, the penguin, and the dolphin all spend time in water. The shark and the dolphin spending the most time in the water, obviously. So the dolphin is going to have a flipper that looks a lot like the whale's flipper in the previous example. The penguin is going to have a wing much similar to a bird, and the shark will have a fin that is going to be kind of like shaped like a fan. If you've ever seen like an ornamental fan, that is kind of what that structure would look like connected to the shark's body, which is very different from the actual structure of a flipper in a dolphin or the wing of a penguin. And these structures arose due to the similar environment of being in the water. These help the animals turn and navigate the water. Bird wings and insect wings would also be analogous structures, as these structures are similar in their function but very different in their structure. As you can see, there are no bones in an insect wing and bones in a bird wing. So this would just be one example of how they are similar in their function but different in their structure. Okay, so analogous structures and homologous structures can be a little bit confusing, so I have posted a video that you guys can watch on that as well. Okay, so anatomy as evidence. One last thing that we would need to look at, vestigial structures, and these are structures that are remnants of close common ancestors but have little or no use to us today. So an example would be human goosebumps. So this is what happens when you get the chills. Your hair kind of stands up on end, and what this is a reflex to being cold. Your hair stands up in an attempt to try and trap heat, as happens in a lot of mammals that are furry, so like dogs, cats, bears, those sorts of things. It does not work very well in humans because we do not have enough hair, especially considering that humans shave themselves quite frequently. So if you shave your legs, when you get goosebumps, it is just annoying because then you have to shave your legs again. And that's just, so human goosebumps are, show a common ancestor with an animal that used to be very furry. Okay, the appendix. So this is actually the appendix. It is located on the cecum of our large intestine. So the cecum is just the very first part, and then it is going to be roughly the size of your pinky, and it has almost no use or function in the body today. It was thought to used to have been a immune system support, but today it essentially just kind of dangles there until it'll randomly try and kill you. So what essentially happens is your appendix, the size of your pinky normally, will begin to swell as it gets infected with essentially feces from your large intestine, and it will swell to probably the size of about the size of a hot dog. And then if it bursts, it can kill you because you are releasing all these dangerous bacteria that are normally stored in your large intestine into your abdomen cavity. So your appendix is not good. And then also another example would just be wisdom teeth in humans. So these actually aren't always found in humans. So some humans don't grow their wisdom teeth. They're just not present. And you can actually you generally will have to get these teeth removed before they crowd your mouth and just absolutely destroy your teeth. So, wisdom teeth, also remnants of a past ancestor, just kind of an annoyance today. Okay, so this is a good time to stop and watch the video on analogous and homologous structures. We're going to press on. So, fossils as evidence. So, fossils are traces of organisms that existed in the past, and they provide evidence by showing a sequential change in the complexity of life. So, taking a look at this image, you see as the further down you go, the older the rocks, therefore the older the fossils. So we have a T-Rex head right here. That T-Rex head would actually be younger than this trilobite that is down here. The trilobite would be older than the T-Rex. And this idea is just called the law of superposition, where the deeper you go, the older the fossil will be. It's not an overly complex law, or it just kind of the lower it is, the older it is, the higher up it is in the earth, the younger it is. Okay, so fossils as evidence, part 2. So fossils also show the sequential changing of organisms. So this would be a transitional fossil. Transitional fossils shed light on evolutionary history. So one example would actually be Tiktaalik, which is this little guy right here. Kind of looks like a salamander. He is actually a fish, and he is the first vertebrate thought to be able to walk on land. And by walk, I just kind of mean flop around. Tiktaalik was long considered a missing link between when fish first transitioned to land, and this was way before the dinosaurs, about 100 million years before the dinosaurs actually. And this fossil was found in the hilly Canadian Arctic, although Tiktaalik is thought to have lived in freshwater streams, not in the Canadian Arctic. They were thought to be living much closer to the equator. So keep this in mind for the review at the end. And that would be a great time to stop and go and watch the Tiktaalik video. It's about 2 minutes. Alright, so observational evidence for Tiktaalik could be how his... So one thing that we observe would be his forelimb structure as an adaptation, so his arms essentially, or how his fins developed into arms. This would be an adaptation that through time progressed. Biogeographical evidence, so this could be the movement from near equator to the Canadian Arctic. And then an anatomical evidence, again, would just be the forelimb structure. So that forelimb structure is a homologous trait, believe it or not. Because if you remember in the video, he had a very similar structure to that of kind of like the whale, essentially. Okay, and then finally, fossil evidence for Tiktaalik. He was a transitional fossil. That made a link between when fish first came out of the sea and began to inhabit land, which eventually led to amphibians. Okay? And that is going to be the end of the notes. I apologize for it being so long, but I hope that you guys have a great night.